Why is it illegal in this state to walk across the street on your hands, yet perfectly legal for an entire town to run its own full government smaller than your neighborhood? Welcome to 71 Dumbest Facts from Connecticut, where we are exposing the wildest historical facts like the time this tiny state supplied George Washington's entire army with food, clothing, and weapons, while also inventing your door lock, your lollipop, and the world's first phone book. We are covering absurd laws about bouncing pickles and beauticians humming at work. Alongside the myths you still believe, like thinking Connecticut is just a boring little state nobody cares about. We are proving which insane stories are 100% real history and which are just made-up nonsense, so hit that subscribe button before we reveal the truth. 1. There was a man in Connecticut who decided the most logical way to cross the street was on his hands, and apparently enough people agreed that the state had to make it illegal. Yes, Connecticut lawmakers sat down, looked each other in the eyes, and wrote an actual law banning hand-walking across streets. Nobody questioned why this needed a law. Nobody asked how many people were doing it. They just banned it and moved on like it was completely normal. 2. Picture a man in Devon, Connecticut finishing a late evening stroll and deciding to walk home backwards just for fun. The local government did not find this fun at all. Devon passed an actual ordinance making it illegal to walk backwards after sunset. No explanation was given to residents. No reason was recorded in the town minutes. A grown adult simply could not moonwalk home after dark in Devon, Connecticut, without technically breaking the law, and that is a certified American fact. 3. Connecticut never officially signed the Articles of Confederation on time, and the Founding Fathers were absolutely not impressed. While every other state was showing up and doing the paperwork, Connecticut was somewhere in the back acting like the deadline did not apply to them. George Washington needed a united country, and Connecticut was treating the whole thing like a group project they forgot about. They eventually signed, but the damage to their reputation was done. Connecticut was officially the slowpoke of the founding states, and history wrote it down permanently. 4. A man named George Smith was sitting in New Haven, Connecticut in 1908, probably just trying to sell some candy, when he looked at a piece of hard sugar on a stick and thought, this needs a name and legal protection. So he trademarked the word lollipop and changed snack history forever. Every single child in America who has ever enjoyed a lollipop owes that moment to a candy man in Connecticut, who was serious enough about sugar on a stick to involve lawyers and paperwork. That is Connecticut energy in its purest form. 5. Connecticut has a town called Stamford and another town called New Stamford, and both of them are named after Stamford in England. Nobody in England asked for this honor. Nobody in England requested two American towns carry their name. The original Stamford in England has never acknowledged either of them publicly. Connecticut just looked across the Atlantic Ocean, decided a foreign city deserved double the tribute, and named two separate towns after it without sending so much as a thank you letter to the source material. 6. In 1784, the first law school in America opened its doors in Litchfield, Connecticut, and the building was so small it would lose a square footage competition against most modern bathroom renovations. The lawyers who would go on to shape the entire American legal system sat crammed inside this tiny room, reading books and arguing about justice. 2 future vice presidents studied there. Multiple senators and governors came out of that little building. Connecticut basically produced the legal backbone of a nation, from a space most people today would use to store gardening equipment. 7. So as Mark Twain moved to Hartford, Connecticut, looked around and told everyone it was the most beautiful city in the entire country. He built a massive house there. He wrote some of his most famous books there. He lived there for nearly 2 decades, singing Hartford's praises to anyone who would listen. Then he left. He moved away and never permanently came back. The man who declared Hartford the most beautiful city in America quietly packed his things and relocated, proving that even the greatest American storyteller was not above a dramatic exit with zero explanation. 8. Connecticut calls itself the insurance capital of the world and has built an entire identity around the insurance industry being the crown jewel of its economy. Hartford is packed with massive insurance company headquarters. The industry shaped the city's skyline and its history. However, if you actually survey the people living in Connecticut, the majority of them do not work in insurance at all. The state proudly wears a crown built by an industry that most of its own residents have nothing to do with professionally, and somehow nobody finds this strange. 9. Every single lake in Connecticut is fake. Not metaphorically fake, but literally man-made or carved from a widened river section by human hands. Connecticut has no natural lakes whatsoever. See, when residents go to the lake on a summer weekend, they are swimming in something that was engineered and constructed. The state that helped build the legal and industrial foundation of America could not produce a single naturally occurring body of still water. Connecticut just looked at nature's checklist and said, lakes are not something we do here, and moved on completely unbothered. 10. Yale University was built specifically to train Puritan ministers. See, the entire original purpose of one of the most powerful universities on earth was to produce deeply religious men who would go preach Puritan values across New England. That was the plan. That was the mission statement. Yale is now one of the most secular elite institutions in the world, producing presidents, lawyers, scientists, and billionaires. The Puritan founders who built it to spread religious devotion would not recognize a single thing about it today. And that might be the greatest plot twist in American education history. 11. There is a town in Connecticut called Moosup, and the name sounds exactly like something you would give a town that had a serious moose problem. Residents probably get asked about moose constantly by visitors who assume the name tells the whole story. The truth is, Moosup was named after a Native American chief, and not a single moose has ever been documented living there. Connecticut just let an entire town carry a name that misleads every outsider who reads it, and never once considered putting up a sign to explain the confusion. 12. The town of Southington, Connecticut, looked at its Halloween celebration and decided the greatest threat to public safety was not traffic or crowded streets, but silly string. Local officials sat in a meeting room and drafted an actual town ordinance specifically banning silly string on Halloween night. Children across Southington had to celebrate the spookiest night of the year without the ability to spray foam string at their friends. Connecticut managed to take one of the most harmless products ever invented and turn it into a legal matter requiring government intervention and a formal ordinance. 13. Now, Connecticut is one of the smallest states in the entire country. And yet when the Civil War started, this tiny piece of New England sent more soldiers per capita to fight than almost every other northern state combined. While bigger states were still organizing their regiments, Connecticut men were already marching. The state had very little land and not many people, but it showed up for the Union cause in numbers that embarrassed much larger neighbors. Connecticut proved that the size of the state on a map had absolutely nothing to do with the size of its commitment. 14. The tin can was invented, and people were thrilled about food preservation until everyone realized there was no clean way to open one. For 48 years, Americans dealt with tin cans using hammers, chisels, knives, and whatever sharp object was nearby because nobody had invented the can opener yet. Then Connecticut stepped in, and a man in this state created the first practical can opener, ending nearly 5 decades of Americans wrestling with their own lunch. Connecticut waited until the suffering was truly unbearable, and then casually solved a problem that should have been solved the same week the can was invented. 15. Mystic Connecticut sounds like a town where fortune tellers live and mysterious things happen on foggy nights and locals whisper about strange occurrences near the water. Tourists arrive expecting something supernatural and atmospheric. The actual origin of the name Mystic comes from the Algonquian word Missituck, which simply refers to a large tidal river. There is nothing mystical about it at all. Connecticut named a town after a geographic water feature and then watched for generations as visitors showed up expecting magic and left having learned a vocabulary lesson about Native American river terminology instead. 16. In 1904, a man was driving through Connecticut minding his own business when a police officer pulled him over and handed him a piece of paper that changed American history. So he was caught traveling at 12 miles per hour, which the authorities decided was dangerously fast. That traffic stop became the first automobile speeding ticket ever issued in the United States. The driver probably argued that 12 miles per hour was barely moving. Connecticut disagreed, and in doing so, accidentally created a tradition of roadside frustration that hundreds of millions of Americans would experience forever after. 17. By Katharine Hepburn grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, and her family was not just respected in the community, they were so established and so prominent that they had their own personal pew physically bolted to the church floor so nobody else could ever sit there. This was a family that did not leave church seating to chance. and Catherine went on to become one of the greatest actresses in Hollywood history, winning 4 Academy Awards. But she started life in a Hartford church where her family had literally screwed their furniture into the building to claim permanent territory. 18. Every time someone locks their front door, they are unknowingly participating in Connecticut history. Linus Yale Jr. grew up in Salisbury, Connecticut, and invented the pin tumbler lock that became the standard door lock used across the entire world. The Yale lock is now so universal that most people have never once questioned where it came from or who made it. Billions of doors on every continent are secured by a mechanism designed by a man from a small Connecticut town, and most of those billions of people have never heard his name or his state. 19. Connecticut put a bounty on wolves. The last wolf in the state was tracked down and killed in 1837, and the hunter who did it did not just receive community thanks or a handshake from the mayor. The state of Connecticut handed him a formal cash reward as official payment for eliminating the animal. There was a government-approved budget line for wolf removal, and Connecticut spent it. The state celebrated the permanent disappearance of an entire species from its land, the way other states celebrated new buildings, and the hunter walked away with taxpayer money for his trouble. 20. A book. Connecticut spends more money per student on education than almost every other state in the country. The classrooms are funded, the teachers are paid, the resources are there. And yet when researchers measure actual improvement in student performance, Connecticut ranks in the bottom half of American states. The state is essentially running the most expensive educational experiment in the country and producing average results. Connecticut looked at the idea that money solves problems in education and decided to test that theory as aggressively as possible, and the results have been genuinely confusing for decades. 21. Before the United States Constitution existed, before the Founding Fathers had their famous arguments in Philadelphia, a group of men in Connecticut sat down in 1639 and wrote the Fundamental Orders, which became the first written constitution in American history. America did not exist yet. The country had no name and no flag, but Connecticut already had a governing document with rules and structure and legal order. The state that everyone forgets about at dinner parties was quietly writing constitutional law before the nation it belongs to was even a thought in anybody's mind. 22. Connecticut once had a law in the books requiring every male citizen over the age of 60 to own a firearm. Not suggested, not encouraged, required by law. A 65-year-old man with bad knees and shaky hands was legally obligated to be armed under Connecticut statute. And nobody appeared to stop and ask whether this made practical sense for the population it was targeting. Connecticut looked at its elderly male residents and decided that retirement age was exactly the right time to make gun ownership a legal requirement with 0 exceptions written into the rule. 23. Hartford, Connecticut in the 1800s had a city-owned herd of cows that wandered around grazing on public land in the middle of what was supposed to be a growing American city. Citizens walked past government cows on their way to work. Children played near municipally owned livestock on public commons. Hartford was simultaneously trying to present itself as a sophisticated urban center, while also maintaining an official city cow situation that nobody seemed to find contradictory. The cows grazed on public property funded by taxpayers who apparently had no strong feelings about sharing their commons with cattle. 24. Why, before Connecticut got involved, your rubber tires would have melted in summer heat and cracked in winter cold, making automobile travel basically impossible in extreme temperatures. Charles Goodyear figured out vulcanized rubber, and Connecticut commercialized the process, turning it into something that could actually be manufactured and sold at scale. Every car on every highway in America rides on technology that Connecticut helped bring into the world. And the state that most people associate with insurance and quiet suburbs is also quietly responsible for the fact that modern road transportation functions at all. 25. Connecticut is smaller than some individual counties in states like Texas and Montana. A person could drive across Connecticut in under 2 hours on a bad traffic day. And yet this tiny rectangle of New England contains 169 separate towns each, with its own full-functioning local government complete with elected officials, budgets, town meetings, and municipal employees. Connecticut does not believe in consolidation or efficiency when it comes to governance. Every town runs itself independently like a tiny sovereign nation that happens to share a border with other tiny sovereign nations, all inside one very small state. 26. The first color television broadcast in American history did not happen in Hollywood or New York City. It happened in Connecticut, where the technology was developed and tested before the rest of the country knew color television was even possible. Connecticut engineers were broadcasting in color while most Americans were still watching black and white screens and had no idea anything different existed. Yet the state that invented the door lock and the lollipop and the can opener quietly added color television to its list of contributions, and then let other states take most of the credit in popular history. 27. Connecticut once had an actual law-targeting stage magicians, requiring performers to prove that their tricks were not real sorcery before they could perform publicly. A magician pulling a rabbit from a hat in Connecticut had to legally establish that no actual magic was involved in the production of that rabbit. Audiences who came to be entertained were essentially watching a performer who had already been cleared by the government as a non-wizard. Connecticut drew a legal line between entertainment and witchcraft and made sure every man with a top hat and a deck of cards stayed firmly on the correct side of it. 28. Connecticut went without a state income tax longer than almost any other state in the country, and when the government finally passed one in 1991, residents treated it like an act of war. Protesters flooded the streets outside the Capitol building in Hartford. The demonstrations grew so large and so angry that the situation nearly became a full riot. Police were called. Officials were surrounded. Connecticut residents who had spent their entire lives without an income tax reacted to its introduction with a level of outrage that most states reserve for genuine emergencies and natural disasters rather than tax policy changes. 29. There is a valley in Connecticut where the same thunderstorm comes back almost every single summer like it has a reservation. Meteorologists have tracked what locals call the Farmington Valley Storm for 40 years, watching it return to the same geographic location with remarkable consistency. The valley essentially has a recurring weather appointment that shows up annually, whether residents want it or not. Scientists have studied the topography and the atmospheric patterns, trying to explain why this particular storm keeps choosing this particular valley. Connecticut has managed to make even severe weather feel like a local tradition with a loyal following. 30. In 1831, Wesleyan University in Connecticut did something that most of the country would not do for decades afterward. It granted a degree to a woman in a co-educational setting, making it the first American university to officially recognize that women were capable of completing the same academic requirements as men. This happened before most states had even considered the question. Before the Civil War, before women could vote, before most institutions acknowledged women as serious academic participants, Connecticut produced a female college graduate and handed her a degree like it was the obvious and logical thing to do. 31. Hartford, Connecticut was not always the quiet insurance city that Americans picture today. There was a period in American history when Hartford was the richest city per capita in the entire United States. Richer than New York City, richer than Boston, richer than every other urban center in the country. The money came from manufacturing, insurance, and trade, and for a brief, extraordinary moment, this small New England city sat at the absolute top of the American wealth ladder. Hartford went from the richest city in America to a city most people forget exists, and that transition is one of the most dramatic falls in American urban history. 32. Hartford, Connecticut had a law in its books making it illegal to educate your dog in certain public ways. Training a dog in specific public settings violated city code and was treated as an actual offense worth writing into municipal law. Hartford residents who wanted an obedient pet had to navigate government regulations about where and how that obedience could be taught. The city that produced insurance giants and constitutional history also found time to regulate the academic progress of household pets and apparently felt strongly enough about dog training locations to make the restriction official and enforceable by law. 33. In the 1700s, Connecticut decided that windows were a taxable luxury and started charging residents money based on how many windows their homes contained. Poor families across the state responded the only logical way they could think of by bricking up their windows entirely to reduce their tax burden. Connecticut homes went dark. Families sat in dimly lit rooms because the government had decided that natural light was something only wealthy people should enjoy without financial penalty. The state essentially taxed sunshine, and residents chose darkness over paying, and nobody in the government apparently reconsidered the policy quickly enough. 34. Connecticut had almost no textile industry of its own, and yet the first American factory dedicated to manufacturing sewing machines opened right there in the state. The machines were built in Connecticut, but the fabric they were designed to sew was being produced everywhere else. Connecticut created the technology that would revolutionize the clothing industry for a market it barely participated in. The state essentially handed a powerful industrial tool to its neighbors, wrapped it up and sent it out without keeping much of the benefit for itself, which is either extremely generous or extremely poor economic planning depending on your perspective. 35. See, somewhere in Connecticut's history, a group of residents sat in a town meeting and voted on whether to name their new settlement Boring. The name was on the table. It was a real option being seriously considered by real people who would have had to introduce themselves as residents of Boring, Connecticut for the rest of their lives. The vote happened, and the residents rejected it, choosing a different name and saving themselves from a lifetime of embarrassing introductions. Our Connecticut came within one town meeting vote of having a place called Boring on its official map. And the margin was apparently not as comfortable as you might expect. 36. In 1803, the town of Salisbury, Connecticut, opened America's first public library funded entirely by tax dollars, making it the original model for every public library that exists in the United States today. Before, Salisbury libraries were private clubs for wealthy people who could afford memberships. Salisbury decided that books should be available to everyone regardless of income, and backed that belief with public money. Every time an American walks into a public library and checks out a book for free, they are participating in a tradition that started in a small Connecticut town that decided reading was a public right, not a private privilege. 37. P.T. Odd Barnum. The man who built the American circus and taught the country to love spectacle and showmanship was born in Bethel, Connecticut, and his very first business venture was selling a fake mummy to the public. He found an elderly woman he claimed was 160 years old and had once been a nurse to George Washington and charged people money to look at her. She was not 160 years old. She had never met George Washington. De Barnum was from Connecticut, charged admission for a lie, and the public loved it. And that is essentially the entire story of American entertainment. 38. In Manchester, Connecticut, the Cheney brothers built a silk manufacturing operation so large and so productive that it became the single biggest silk complex in the entire Western Hemisphere. Manchester, Connecticut was the silk capital of the Western world. The mill employed thousands of workers and produced silk that was shipped across the country and around the globe. A small Connecticut town was running the largest silk operation on 2 continents, and most Americans today have never heard of the Cheney brothers or their mill or the fact that the fabric in their grandmother's finest dress probably came from Manchester, Connecticut. 39. Saying in Simsbury, Connecticut, there is a sycamore tree that was already alive before the American Revolution started, and it is still standing today. The Pinchot sycamore has watched Connecticut go from a British colony to a founding state to a modern suburb, and has not moved or complained once during the entire process. It survived wars, economic collapses, industrial revolutions, and highway construction. While American history unfolded around it, this tree simply kept growing and is now the largest tree in the entire state. Connecticut has a living witness to its entire existence, and it is rooted in a Simsbury field, minding its own business. 40. The Electric Boat Shipyard in Groton, Connecticut, has built more than 80 United States Navy submarines, making Connecticut the undisputed submarine manufacturing capital of the country. So the state that most Americans associate with Yale and insurance and small towns has been quietly building the most powerful underwater military vessels in the world for over a century. Nuclear submarines that patrol the ocean floor and carry weapons capable of changing global history were assembled by workers in Connecticut and launched into the Thames River. Connecticut is building instruments of serious national defense and has been doing it longer than most Americans realize. 41. Connecticut passed an actual law requiring citizens to wrap used razor blades before throwing them away, and that law is technically still on the books today. Someone in the Connecticut state legislature sat down, looked at the problem of unwrapped razor blades in garbage cans, and decided this required formal government intervention with written rules and legal consequences. The law has never been removed or updated or questioned in any official session since it was written. How Connecticut residents throwing away a disposable razor in the 21st century are still technically subject to a blade wrapping requirement that has been sitting in state law completely undisturbed for decades. 42. In Waterbury, Connecticut, a beautician who hummed while cutting hair was not just being mildly annoying, she was breaking the law. An actual ordinance was written and enforced in Waterbury, making it illegal for a beautician to hum during work hours. A woman giving a haircut had to do it in complete musical silence or risk violating city code. Nobody recorded what specific humming incident inspired this law or which beautician pushed officials over the edge. Waterbury simply decided one day that the sound of a happy worker enjoying her job through quiet melody was a problem serious enough to require a government solution. 43. In 1775, a Connecticut man named David Bushnell built a submarine and called it the Turtle. And the United States military was so impressed they decided to use it in an actual combat mission during the Revolutionary War. The Turtle was sent underwater to attach an explosive device to a British warship anchored in New York Harbor. The mission failed completely. The submarine could not attach the bomb. The operator barely escaped. The warship was completely unharmed. Connecticut invented the military submarine for America and then watched it fail its only assignment while the British sailors above had no idea any of it had happened. 44. Margaret Rudkin was a housewife in Fairfield, Connecticut, who started baking homemade bread in her kitchen because her son had serious health problems, and she believed better ingredients would help him. She baked the bread. The bread was good. Neighbors wanted it. Stores wanted it. And demand grew faster than her kitchen could handle. She built a bakery and named it Pepperidge Farm, after her property, and turned a mother's home remedy into a company worth $60 million. Connecticut produced one of the most successful food brands in American history, from a sick child, a concerned mother, and a kitchen in Fairfield that was simply trying to help one small boy feel better. 45. Connecticut has a Thanksgiving Cove. It also has a Christmas Village. And somewhere else entirely, it has an Easter Street. All three of these places are real locations in different Connecticut towns that somehow independently decided to name themselves after major holidays without any coordination between them. No state planning committee connected the dots. No official noticed the pattern forming across the map. Connecticut simply accumulated holiday-themed place names across its tiny geography over the years, and nobody ever gathered in a room and acknowledged that this small state had quietly claimed 3 of the 4 major American holidays as street and town names. 46. The very first phone book ever published in American history came out of New Haven, Connecticut in 1878, and it contained exactly 50 names. There were no phone numbers listed in it at all. The entire concept of the phone number had not been standardized yet, so the book simply told readers to pick up the phone and ask the operator to connect them to whoever they wanted. New Haven published a directory of phone users before anyone figured out that numbers would be more useful than names. Connecticut invented the phone book and then immediately proved that the first version of any new idea is rarely the best one. 47. Noah Webster grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut, and decided that America needed its own dictionary separate from British English, with American spellings, American words, and American identity baked into every single definition. He spent 27 years writing it. To make sure he was doing the job correctly, he taught himself 26 different languages so he could trace word origins across human history. Webster did not just write a book about words, he learned a significant portion of human linguistic history to make sure the book was right. Connecticut produced the man who defined the American language, and he did it by spending nearly 3 decades in relentless obsessive scholarship. 48. When the Revolutionary War needed funding, and the federal government had not yet figured out how to raise money, Connecticut stepped forward and created the first war bonds in American history. The state invented the financial instrument that allowed citizens to loan money to the war effort in exchange for repayment later. Connecticut did not wait for the federal government to solve the funding problem. It looked at George Washington's army running low on resources and invented a solution that the national government would eventually copy and use for every major American war that followed. Connecticut accidentally created modern government war financing before the government knew it needed it. 49. Connecticut's coastline is disappearing. Not dramatically, and not all at once, but measurably and consistently, the state's shoreline shrinks by several inches every single year due to erosion. The beaches Connecticut residents visit in summer are slightly smaller than they were the summer before. The state is physically getting smaller over time in a way that can be tracked and measured and documented by scientists. Connecticut is one of the most densely governed states in the country, with 169 town governments managing every detail of local life. And not one of those governments can do anything about the fact that the state itself is slowly being eaten by the ocean. 50. In the 1960s, a Connecticut school made the decision to ban the color red from its classrooms, entirely based on a study that claimed red walls and red objects caused students to become more aggressive and harder to manage. Teachers removed red items. Walls were repainted. The color was treated as a genuine behavioral threat to student learning. The study was later completely debunked by researchers who found no credible connection between the color red and student aggression. Connecticut had banned a color from a school based on science that turned out to be wrong, and then quietly moved on without any formal acknowledgement that the whole thing had been a mistake. 51. In 1895, a man in New Haven, Connecticut, walked into a patent office and filed paperwork claiming he had invented the hamburger. Not a restaurant in Manhattan, not a famous chef in Chicago. A man in New Haven, Connecticut, decided that ground beef pressed into a patty and served between bread was his idea, and he wanted legal credit for it. Lewis Lassen ran a small lunch wagon and served the sandwich to local workers who probably had no idea they were eating a moment of American culinary history. Connecticut quietly holds the original hamburger patent, and New Haven has been trying to get proper recognition for this achievement from a country that keeps giving the credit to everyone else. 52. The town of Guilford, Connecticut was so serious about Christmas decorations coming down on time that it created an actual law with a formal fine attached to it. Residents had until January 14th to remove every wreath, every light, and every ornament from their property. Miss the deadline, and the town would charge you money for the offense. So a family that loved Christmas a little too much and left their decorations up an extra week was not just being lazy, they were technically committing a finable violation of Guilford Municipal Code. Connecticut managed to put a legal expiration date on holiday cheer and back it up with the threat of financial consequences. 53. Connecticut. Governor John Trumbull did not just face political opposition from rivals or criticism from newspaper editors. His own state legislature came after him legally, and he became a Connecticut governor who faced actual arrest proceedings initiated by the government he was supposed to be leading. The man sitting in the highest executive office in the state found himself in a legal confrontation with the legislative branch that was supposed to work alongside him. Connecticut managed to create a situation where the governor and the legislature were not just disagreeing about policy, but actively pursuing each other through legal channels like two neighbors fighting over a property line. 54. Connecticut became the fishing hook capital of America for a brief and genuinely unexpected period in the 19th century when manufacturers in the state began producing the first steel fish hooks made on American soil. Before Connecticut got involved, American fishermen were using hooks imported from abroad or made by hand from inferior materials. Connecticut factories started stamping out steel hooks at industrial scale, and suddenly the entire American fishing industry was dependent on a landlocked manufacturing state for the tool that made their profession possible. Connecticut had almost no significant fishing industry of its own, but it was building the equipment that everyone else needed to fish. High 55. There is a town in Connecticut called Voluntown, and the name tells a story that the current residents probably do not fully appreciate. After the Revolutionary War, the colonial government promised land grants to soldiers who had volunteered to fight, and Voluntown was the parcel set aside specifically for those veterans. The volunteers received the land on paper, accepted the grant officially, and then almost none of them actually moved there. And the town was named after the people who were supposed to populate it, and then those people simply did not show up. Voluntown, Connecticut exists as a permanent reminder of soldiers who earned a town and then decided they would rather live somewhere else. 56. Connecticut built the first American warship and launched it into history in 1776. The USS Oliver Cromwell was constructed in the state and sent out to fight the British Navy during the Revolutionary War, making it the first combat vessel built on American soil for the American cause. Connecticut was not a coastal powerhouse with a massive naval tradition, but when the country needed a warship, the state built one anyway. Say, the same state that was supplying Washington's army with food and clothing and weapons was simultaneously constructing military vessels and essentially running a one-state war supply operation that the rest of the colonies were extremely grateful for. 57 Hartford, Connecticut built the first artificial ice rink in America and introduced indoor skating to a country that had never experienced the concept before. Oh, this happened before most Americans had ever seen a mechanical refrigerator or understood how artificial cooling worked on any scale. Hartford residents were gliding across manufactured ice in an enclosed building, while the technology making it possible was so new that most of their fellow Americans did not know it existed. Or Connecticut took a winter activity that had always depended entirely on cold weather and natural conditions, and turned it into something that could happen on a schedule inside a building, regardless of what the temperature was doing outside. 58. Somewhere in a Hartford, Connecticut archive, there is an insurance contract written in 1810 that has never been officially voided, canceled, or closed out. The contract was filed properly according to the rules of the time, and because nobody ever completed the formal process of terminating it, the document remains technically active more than 200 years after it was written. Hartford is the insurance capital of the world, and it cannot close a 2-century-old piece of paperwork sitting in its own filing system. Connecticut built an entire global industry around managing risk and contracts, and is currently failing to manage one single contract from the era of horse-drawn carriages. 59. Connecticut residents call things mountains. They have names for their mountains. People hike their mountains and post about their mountains and feel genuine pride about their mountains. The United States Geological Survey looked at every single elevated landform in Connecticut, measured them, applied the official scientific criteria for what constitutes a mountain, and classified every last one of them as hills. Connecticut has no mountains. It has hills that Connecticut decided to call mountains because the alternative was admitting that the highest point in the state would not qualify for mountain status anywhere west of the Appalachians. The mountains of Connecticut are hills, and the geological record is not interested in local feelings about the matter. 60. Connecticut students in the year 1800 were required by law to memorize the entire Connecticut state constitution before they could graduate, not summarize it, not understand its themes, memorize it word for word in its entirety. The Connecticut state constitution is not a short document. Why, it is a lengthy, detailed legal text that took serious men considerable time to write and debate and ratify. Connecticut educators looked at this dense legal document and decided it was appropriate homework for school-age children who were also learning to read and write at the same time. Students who could not recite constitutional law from memory were not considered educated enough to leave school. 61. Connecticut Health Commissioner Frederick Holcomb sat down in 1948 and made one of the most specific and unusual regulatory decisions in American food history. He ruled that a pickle could only be legally sold in Connecticut if it bounced when dropped. Not if it smelled right or looked right or tasted right, but if it physically bounced off a surface when you dropped it from a height. Vendors who brought non-bouncing pickles to market were selling an illegal product under Connecticut law. The bounce test became the official state standard for pickle authenticity, and Connecticut grocery inspectors were apparently expected to go around dropping cucumbers to enforce it. 62. In New Britain, Connecticut, local officials decided that a citizen walking too fast in public was creating a disturbance serious enough to warrant police attention. Walking fast was not a traffic violation or a safety hazard in any documented way, but New Britain treated brisk pedestrian movement as a threat to public order worth putting into city code. A person late for work hour walking through downtown New Britain was technically in violation of a municipal ordinance designed to keep the streets calm. And Connecticut managed to criminalize urgency and made it legally safer to stroll leisurely through New Britain than to move through it with any kind of purpose or momentum. 63. In 1796, a woman named Amelia Simmons sat down in Hartford, Connecticut, and wrote a cookbook that became the first American cookbook ever published in the history of the country. Before Amelia, all the cookbooks available in America were British and filled with British ingredients, British measurements, and British recipes that assumed access to things most American households did not have. Amelia wrote for American kitchens using American ingredients and American language, and published it in Hartford, changing the way the entire country thought about cooking. Or Connecticut produced the woman who first told America how to feed itself, and her cookbook is still studied by food historians today. 64. The entire United States headquarters of Pez Candy is located in Orange, Connecticut. The little plastic dispensers with the character heads that flip back to release a candy tablet have their American operational base in a Connecticut town called Orange. Pez was invented in Austria, but its American home is in Connecticut and has been for decades. Children across the country collect Pez dispensers, trade them, and display them without any awareness that the company managing all of it is operating out of a Connecticut town. Connecticut is home to the insurance capital of the world, the first American cookbook, and apparently also the global headquarters of a beloved Austrian candy with a cartoon head. 65. Sonic, Connecticut produced the first written speed limit law in American history in 1901, when Hartford set an official maximum speed for horse-drawn carriages on city streets. This happened 3 years before automobiles became common enough to worry about. Hartford was regulating traffic speed before traffic, as Americans now understand it actually existed. The city looked at horses moving through its streets and decided there needed to be a legal ceiling on how fast they could go, and wrote it down officially. When cars eventually arrived, Connecticut was already experienced in the business of telling people they were moving too fast and was fully prepared to extend that tradition to motorized vehicles. 66. There is a haunted house attraction in Connecticut that charges visitors exactly $1 per scare and has been taken to court by customers who felt the experience was more frightening than they had agreed to. People paid money specifically to be scared, then experienced fear, and then hired lawyers about it. So the attraction has faced legal complaints from visitors who apparently believed there was a reasonable upper limit to the terror they were purchasing with their dollar, and that the haunted house had exceeded it without proper disclosure. Connecticut has managed to create litigation around the haunted house industry, which is genuinely one of the more remarkable legal developments in state history. 67. Our Connecticut has a law on its books making it illegal to sell a live duck to anyone under the age of 18, unless the purchase involves more than 6 ducks at once. A teenager cannot buy 1 duck or 2 ducks or 5 ducks in Connecticut without violating state law. But if that same teenager is buying 7 or more live ducks, the transaction becomes completely legal. The law apparently assumes that bulk duck purchasing indicates serious agricultural intent rather than juvenile impulsiveness. Connecticut drew a legal line at 6 ducks and decided that the 7th duck was the one that transformed an irresponsible minor into a legitimate poultry customer worthy of completing the sale. 68. Connecticut ratified the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution 108 years late. When the amendment was passed in 1868, granting citizenship and equal protection to all people born on American soil, Connecticut was supposed to ratify it, along with the other states. Connecticut did not. The state failed to complete the ratification in 1868, and the oversight sat unaddressed for over a century until 1976, when Connecticut finally got around to making it official. The amendment had already been part of the Constitution for over 100 years, functioning perfectly well without Connecticut's approval. But the state eventually showed up to ratify civil rights legislation that had long since changed American history without them. 69. During the Revolutionary War, George Washington's army was cold, hungry, and running dangerously low on supplies, and Connecticut responded by becoming the most important supply chain in the entire war effort. The state earned the official nickname the Provision State because it sent more food, clothing, weapons, and equipment to Washington's forces than any other colony. Connecticut was geographically small and did not have the largest population, but it ran its farms and factories at maximum capacity to keep the Continental Army functional. White Washington's soldiers survived brutal winters and extended campaigns in part because Connecticut treated supplying the Revolution as its primary contribution to American independence. 70. In Hartford, Connecticut, it was once illegal to plant a tree on a city street without first obtaining a signed permit from 3 completely separate city departments. A resident who wanted to add a tree to their neighborhood had to navigate 3 layers of municipal bureaucracy, collect 3 separate signatures from 3 different offices, and complete the entire approval process before a single hole could be dug. Hartford was the city that helped invent American constitutional law and ran the most important insurance industry in the world. And it also required triple departmental sign-off before a citizen could put a tree in the ground on a public street. Upper 71. Connecticut was called the Provision State during the Revolution because it fed and supplied Washington's army better than anyone else. It wrote the first constitution before America existed. It invented the lollipop, the door lock, the can opener, the hamburger, and the phone book. It built the first submarine, the first warship, and the first artificial ice rink. It bounces its pickles by law bans its elderly from being unarmed and once almost named a town boring. Connecticut is the smallest state with the loudest history and the most laws nobody can explain, and if you made it to Fact 71 without questioning everything you thought you knew about this country, then Connecticut did its job perfectly. And that was Connecticut. 71 facts that prove the quietest states hide the loudest history. Which law would ruin your life the most? Drop it in the comments. Like this video. Subscribe to Dumbest Things. And we will see you in the next state.